There was a night in February when Meryl Streep sat alone in her hotel room, staring at her reflection in the mirror, and felt nothing. No joy. No pride. Just a quiet, aching emptiness. Outside, the world celebrated her 21st Oscar nomination, a record no one had ever touched, a mountain no one had ever climbed. But inside that room, in the silence between heartbeats, she wondered if any of it had ever been worth the price she'd paid. The question hung in the air like smoke: how many pieces of yourself can you trade for perfection before there's nothing left to recognize? The Academy Awards had defined Meryl Streep's life in ways the public would never fully understand. To the world, she was the actress who couldn't lose, nominated so many times that her presence at the ceremony became as expected as the red carpet itself. 3 golden statues sat on a shelf in her home, catching afternoon light through the windows. 21 nominations stretched across 4 decades like milestones on a map of someone else's life. But what the cameras never captured were the nights before each announcement, when she would lie awake, her mind racing through every scene, every choice, every moment she wondered if she'd given enough. The Oscars weren't just about winning. They were about proving, over and over again, that she deserved to be there at all. It started in 1979, when she was 30 years old and the world was just beginning to learn her name. She'd been nominated for her supporting role in The Deer Hunter, playing Linda, a woman caught between love and loyalty in the wreckage of the Vietnam War. She remembered standing backstage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the theater could hear it. She'd worn a simple dress, nothing too flashy, because she didn't expect to win. And she didn't. Maggie Smith took the statue home for California Suite. But something shifted inside Meryl in that moment of not winning. She felt a strange determination settle into her bones, a voice that whispered, "Next time, be undeniable." The following year, she was nominated again, this time for Kramer vs. Kramer, and this time she won. She walked up those stairs in a white gown, took that golden statue into her hands, and felt the weight of it, not just the physical medal, but the expectation that came with it. Her acceptance speech was brief, gracious, a little breathless. The world saw a triumph. Meryl felt a contract being signed. From that moment forward, she would be measured against an impossible standard, herself. Over the next 4 decades, the nominations kept coming with a relentless regularity that both honored and haunted her. Sophie's Choice. Silkwood. Out of Africa. Ironweed. A Cry in the Dark. Postcards from the Edge. The Bridges of Madison County. One True Thing. Music of the Heart. Adaptation. The Devil Wears Prada. Doubt. Julie and Julia. The Iron Lady. August, Osage County. Into the Woods. Florence Foster Jenkins. The Post. Each one a reminder of her excellence. Each one another link in a chain she couldn't escape. People often asked her how it felt to be nominated so many times, and she learned to smile graciously and say something humble, something self-deprecating. "They keep spelling my name wrong on the envelope," she'd joke, deflecting attention with practiced ease. But the truth was more complicated. Each nomination felt like standing naked before the world, every choice she'd made on-screen dissected by critics, audiences, and her own relentless inner voice. She would read the reviews, even when her publicist begged her not to. She needed to know what people saw when they looked at her work. She needed to understand why this performance was worthy and that one wasn't. She needed to find the pattern, the formula, the secret to being enough. But there was no formula. There was only the work. And the work demanded everything. There were years when the nominations felt like gifts, moments when she'd poured her soul into a role and the recognition felt like the world was seeing what she'd tried so desperately to show them. Winning for Sophie's Choice in 1983 was one of those moments. She'd spent months learning Polish and German, losing weight until her cheekbones cut shadows across her face, diving so deep into Sophie's trauma that she sometimes forgot where the character ended and she began. The role had required her to embody a mother forced to make an impossible choice, and as a mother herself, the emotional excavation felt dangerous, necessary, terrifying. When they called her name that night, she walked to the stage feeling like she'd earned it, like every hour of pain had been worth this single moment of validation. Her speech was emotional, thanking the author William Styron, director Alan Pakula, and acknowledging how the role had changed her understanding of what acting could demand. What she didn't say was that she'd spent the previous night crying in her hotel room, overwhelmed by the weight of Sophie's story, by the real women who'd lived through such horrors, by the responsibility of telling their truth with dignity. But then there were the nominations that felt like burdens. The years when she was nominated for films she knew weren't her best work, when critics seemed to nominate her simply because she was Meryl Streep and that's what you did with Meryl Streep. She hated those nominations more than she hated being overlooked. They felt like pity. Like the industry was patting her on the head and saying, "Good job showing up." She didn't want to show up. She wanted to disappear into characters so completely that people forgot Meryl Streep existed at all. The worst part was the losing. People assumed that after 3 wins, the losses wouldn't sting anymore. They assumed wrong. Every time her name was called as a nominee and someone else's name was announced as the winner, she felt a small death inside. Not because she didn't respect the other actresses, she did, deeply. But because each loss felt like proof that she hadn't been enough. That despite all her preparation, all her research, all her transformation, she'd still fallen short. The smile she wore in those moments was one of her finest performances. She'd clap enthusiastically for the winner, stand if protocol demanded it, and maintain perfect composure while something inside her crumbled just a little. Her family watched her carry this weight, and they worried. Her husband, Don Gummer, would find her at 2 in the morning sitting at the kitchen table with scripts spread out before her, muttering lines to herself, trying to find the heartbeat of a character she'd been living with for months. He'd bring her tea, sit quietly beside her, not trying to pull her back from wherever she'd gone. He understood, as much as anyone could, that this was part of loving Meryl, accepting that she sometimes had to leave them to inhabit other lives, other sorrows, other joys. Her children learned early that when Mom was preparing for a role, she wasn't fully present. She was somewhere else, inhabiting another life, carrying another person's pain. They loved her, but they also knew they had to share her with ghosts. There were school plays she missed because she was on location. Birthday parties where she was physically present but mentally rehearsing a crucial scene. Moments when they needed her and she was too deep inside another character to fully emerge. One of her daughters once asked her, during a rare quiet afternoon when Meryl wasn't working, why she had to disappear so completely into her roles. Why she couldn't just act, the way other people went to work and came home and left their jobs behind. Meryl had struggled to explain it. "I don't know how to do it halfway," she'd said finally. "And if I'm going to tell someone's story, I owe them everything. I owe them my full attention, my full heart. Even if that means borrowing time from the people I love most." Her daughter had nodded, understanding even if she didn't like it. That was the bargain they'd all made, choosing to love someone whose gift required her to temporarily become other people. It wasn't fair, exactly. But it was honest. There was one particular year, she never spoke about it publicly, when she was nominated for a film that had nearly broken her. The character was a mother dealing with impossible choices, confronting the limits of love and duty and sacrifice. Meryl had 4 children of her own, and every scene felt like looking into a dark mirror of what her life could have been if different choices had been made, if different circumstances had intervened. She gave everything to that performance, bleeding out emotionally in take after take, until the director finally called wrap and she could barely remember how to be herself again. Critics called it powerful and devastating. They praised her raw emotional honesty and fearless commitment. She was nominated, as expected. And she lost, as she'd somehow known she would. It wasn't that the performance that won was undeserving, it was brilliant, in fact. But Meryl had hoped, privately, desperately, that this time the Academy would see not just her technical skill but the pieces of her soul she'd left on the screen. That night, after the ceremony, she sat in her hotel bathroom and wept. Not polite tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place she usually kept locked away. Dawn found her there, still in her gown, mascara streaked down her face, and held her while she cried. She whispered something she'd never said aloud before, something she'd barely admitted to herself. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't know if I'm strong enough." He didn't try to fix it. He didn't tell her she was being silly or remind her how many awards she'd already won. He just held her until the storm passed, understanding that sometimes you had to let grief run its course. The next morning, she woke up with swollen eyes and an aching head, washed her face, and went back to work. Because that's what you did. You carried the weight, and you kept moving forward. There was no other option she could imagine. The years accumulated like rings in a tree, each one marking another season of growth and struggle. She worked with directors who challenged her: Mike Nichols, Robert Benton, Clint Eastwood, Stephen Frears, Nora Ephron. She played women of every age, every background, every emotional landscape. Some roles came easily, the character slipping over her like a familiar coat. Others required excavation, months of research and preparation and psychological work to find the truth beneath the surface. She learned to speak with dozens of accents: British, Australian, Polish, Danish, Irish, Italian. She learned to play the violin for one role, to sing opera for another. She studied grief, addiction, courage, compromise, rage, resilience. Each character became a kind of education, teaching her something about the infinite ways human beings survived their lives. But the nominations kept coming, and with them, the pressure. By her 15th nomination, then her 20th, she'd become a curiosity, a record breaker, a phenomenon, a trivia answer. Entertainment reporters would speculate each year about whether this would be the performance that won her a fourth Oscar. Would it be The Devil Wears Prada, where she'd turned a potentially one-note villain into a complex, fascinating woman? Would it be Doubt, where she'd played a nun with such fierce certainty and hidden vulnerability? Would it be Julie and Julia, where she'd captured Julia Child's joy so infectiously that audiences left theaters hungry for more than just food? She wanted to tell them that she'd stopped counting. That the number didn't matter anymore. But she'd learned that certain truths were too complicated for sound bites, and besides, it would sound disingenuous. Of course the nominations mattered. They were validation from her peers, recognition that her work had moved people, touched something real. They just weren't the only thing that mattered. They weren't even the most important thing. Her friends in the industry, other actresses who'd been nominated once or twice or never, sometimes expressed envy at her string of nominations. They saw only the glory, the red carpets, the standing ovations, the permanence of being written into Oscar history. They didn't see the mornings when she woke up with her jaw clenched so tight from stress that she could barely open it. They didn't see the way she obsessed over every line reading, every gesture, every choice, terrified that this would be the performance that proved she'd been a fraud all along. They didn't see the cost of perfectionism, the way it hollowed you out from the inside while making you shine on the outside. There was a conversation she had once with a young actress who just received her first nomination. The girl, though she was nearly 30, Meryl still thought of her as a girl, was glowing, overwhelmed with joy and possibility. She'd sought Meryl out at a pre-Oscar party, desperate for advice, for wisdom, for some magic formula that would help her understand what came next. "How do you handle it?" the young actress asked, her eyes bright with hope and fear. "The pressure, the attention, the feeling that everyone's watching and judging every move you make?" Meryl paused, considering what truth to offer. She could give the standard wisdom: enjoy the moment, don't take it too seriously, remember it's just a statue. But that felt dishonest, too simple for something so complex. So she said something else, something she rarely articulated even to herself. "Learn to separate who you are from what you do," Meryl told her, choosing her words carefully. "Because if you let those things become the same thing, every loss will feel like you're losing yourself. And every win will feel like you've only been given temporary permission to exist. The work is important. The recognition is meaningful. But you're more than your nominations. You're more than your wins. You're more than the sum of your performances. Don't forget that." The young actress nodded solemnly, but Meryl could see she didn't really understand yet. How could she? Understanding only came through experience, through years of riding the wave between praise and rejection, between being called a genius and being overlooked, between feeling invincible and feeling invisible. You couldn't teach that. You could only survive it and hope you came out intact on the other side. As the years accumulated, Meryl found herself becoming more philosophical about the Oscars. She still cared, that never went away completely. But she learned to hold her caring more loosely, like water cupped in her palms instead of ice gripped in her fists. She learned that the nominations said less about her than they said about the industry's relationship with her. She'd become an institution, and institutions are complicated. They're revered and resented, celebrated and taken for granted. People related to her work not just as individual performances but as part of a larger narrative about excellence, longevity, and the evolution of American cinema. She thought sometimes about actresses who'd never been nominated, or who'd been nominated once decades ago and never again. Were they happier? Did they sleep better at night, unburdened by the weight of expectation? Or did they carry their own kinds of pain, the ache of being overlooked, the question of what they could have done differently, the slow fate of being forgotten by an industry that devoured youth and novelty? She suspected every path carried its own specific suffering. Hers just happened to be very public, very documented, very permanent. There was a strange loneliness in being nominated so many times. It set her apart from her peers in ways that were hard to articulate. Other actresses would complain about the awards process, about the politics and campaigning and endless scrutiny, and she would nod sympathetically, but inside she knew her experience was different. For most actresses, Oscar night was a possibility, a hope, maybe even an expectation if the buzz was strong enough. For Meryl, it had become a ritual, an annual referendum on her relevance, a reminder that no matter how many times you proved yourself, you'd have to prove yourself again. She won her third Oscar in 2012 for playing Margaret Thatcher in The Iron Lady, and the victory felt different from the previous two. She was 62 years old. 3 decades had passed since her last win. The standing ovation seemed to acknowledge not just the performance but the entire body of work, the persistence, the decades of showing up and doing excellent work whether the Academy recognized it or not. Her acceptance speech included a joke about how she'd thought she'd lost her voice earlier in the ceremony, and the laughter felt warm, affectionate, familial. But even that win, as meaningful as it was, couldn't erase the sting of the subsequent nominations that didn't convert to statues. August, Osage County, where she'd played a pill-addicted matriarch with savage humor and hidden pain. Into the Woods, where she'd sung Sondheim with such clarity and feeling. Florence Foster Jenkins, where she'd found the humanity in a woman whose talent couldn't match her passion. Each nomination felt like the Academy saying, "We see you, we appreciate you," but not quite saying, "This is the one." The 21st nomination came for the post in 2018, and by then she'd learned to greet the news with quiet gratitude rather than overwhelming emotion. She was 68 years old. She'd been doing this for 4 decades. The nomination felt less like an achievement and more like a continuation, another year, another role, another opportunity to do the work she loved. She didn't win that year either, and she found she was okay with that. Frances McDormand gave a powerful speech about inclusion riders, and Meryl stood with everyone else and applauded, genuinely moved by the moment, by the sense that something might be shifting in the industry, that the conversation was expanding beyond individual recognition to collective responsibility. Later that night, back at her hotel, she looked at herself in the mirror again, the same mirror from decades earlier, or maybe just its echo in another luxury hotel in another year of ceremonies. But this time, she didn't feel empty. She felt full. Full of years and roles and choices and mistakes and triumphs and losses and everything that made up a life lived fully, even if imperfectly. The Oscars hadn't defined her. She defined herself through the Oscars, using each nomination as another opportunity to push deeper, reach further, risk more. She thought about all the characters she'd inhabited over the years, all the women whose lives she'd borrowed and lived and returned. Sophie and Karen and Sarah and Joanna and Francesca and Miranda and Sister Aloysius and Julia and Margaret and Kay and Violet and Florence. Each one had taught her something about survival, about strength, about the many ways women carry impossible weights and keep walking forward. Those characters were her real awards. They were the proof that she'd spent her life doing something that mattered, telling stories that needed to be told, giving voice to experiences that might otherwise remain invisible. The golden statues on her shelf, 3 of them, catching lamplight in the quiet hours, were beautiful objects. She appreciated them. She was grateful for them. But they weren't the point. The point was the work. The point was showing up day after day, year after year, decade after decade, and choosing to be vulnerable on screen, choosing to take risks, choosing to serve the story rather than her ego. The point was that 21 nominations meant 21 times she'd done work worthy of recognition, and that was extraordinary, regardless of how many statues came with it. As she grew older, she found herself caring less about legacy and more about presence. When she was on set now, she didn't worry as much about whether this performance would earn her another nomination. She worried about whether she was telling the truth, whether she was honoring the character, whether she was giving her fellow actors something real to react to, whether the work itself was good, meaningful, honest. The rest was beyond her control, and she'd finally made peace with that fundamental uncertainty. She'd learned that excellence wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up and doing your best with whatever you had that day, your full strength on strong days, your fragile courage on weak ones. It was about being willing to fail, to look foolish, to try something that might not work. It was about trusting the story more than you trusted your own comfort or reputation. People would remember her as the actress with the most Oscar nominations in history. That was fine. It was accurate, after all. It was a record that might stand for generations, a testament to longevity and consistency and the ability to remain relevant across decades of industry change. But she hoped they'd also remember something else, that she'd never played it safe, never coasted, never treated a role as beneath her. She'd given everything to her work, and in doing so, she'd given audiences permission to feel deeply, to struggle openly, to be complicated and contradictory and human. The weight of 21 nominations, it turned out, wasn't a burden to escape. It was a privilege to carry. Each one represented a story told, a life explored, a truth revealed. Each one meant she'd been trusted with material that mattered, with characters worth embodying, with narratives worth sharing. And if carrying that weight meant she'd spent decades questioning herself, pushing herself, doubting herself, well, that was the price of caring deeply about something. She'd paid it willingly, consciously, with full awareness that there were easier paths she could have chosen. On quiet evenings now, when the work was done and the house was still and the grandchildren were asleep in their rooms, she sometimes let herself feel proud. Not of the nominations themselves, but of the courage it took to keep showing up, to keep being vulnerable, to keep offering her heart to stories that might break it. That was the real achievement. Not the golden statues or the record-breaking numbers or the permanent place in film history. But the decades of showing up and doing the work, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. When it would have been easier to rest on past laurels, to coast on reputation, to accept roles that demanded less but paid more. The Oscars had given her many things over the years: recognition, validation, opportunities, financial security, industry respect, pain, perspective, growth, humility. But the greatest gift was this: they'd taught her that she was enough, with or without them. That her value as an artist and as a person wasn't contingent on gold statues or nominations or standing ovations. That the work itself was the reward, the process was the point, and everything else was just noise, sometimes beautiful noise, sometimes painful noise, but noise nonetheless. And that lesson, hard-won and dearly bought, earned through decades of triumph and disappointment and everything in between, was worth more than any statue ever could be. It was the kind of wisdom you couldn't receive, only earn. The kind of peace you couldn't fake, only find. And she'd found it, finally, after 21 nominations and 3 wins and 18 gracious losses and countless moments of doubt and fear and hope. She was enough. She had always been enough. The Oscars had simply given her a very long, very public, very difficult path to discovering that truth.